Novo Nordisk's parent company, Novo Holdings, will buy Catalent for $16.5 billion. Catalent is known as a fill-finish company. So that means filling and packaging syringes and injection pens. It will help Novo Nordisk meet demand for weight loss drugs, Ozempic and Wegovy. Let's bring in Meghan Fitzgerald, Gray Ghost Advisors, private equity investor, and Columbia University healthcare policy professor. Meghan, good to talk to you today. Let's talk about this deal here. I mean, how bullish is that for GLP-1? We've already talked about the momentum there. Is this just a sign of more deals to come?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is a drug class that could potentially be 100 billion. Recent estimates are putting it at 200 billion. So what we're having here is not a demand problem. We're having a supply problem on the product side. So I think it's a great deal by Novo Holdings to think about vertically integrating so they can have more line of sight and more intimacy in something that has been pretty painful, and that is not being able to meet the supply that patients need in the market.
And Meghan, I have to ask you about pricing for some of these GLP-1s, how that's being navigated, given that it is quite cost prohibitive at the moment for your average person, and you have some employers also trying to offer this as well.
Yeah, I mean, for some patients or most, it's about $1,000 a month or $12,000 a year. And some patients have access to coupons. Some patients truly have diabetes, and payers have really been, I think, a little bit more generous to reimburse diabetes, but not so much obesity. There were 9 states that put it on their Medicaid preferred list. And now recently, North Carolina got a $100 million bill last year. It was 10% of the budget, so they've removed it. The Mayo Clinic has now capped out a $20,000 lifetime reimbursement for the products. So the pricing is definitely prohibitive for many patients, but there's still 1 to 5% of the population that is willing to pay the cash and pay $12,000 a year to have access to these medicines. So right now, I think we're seeing a market on the reimbursement side that is largely in flux and unfolding. But right now, it's the folks that can afford it that are really continuing to drive the market and keep the pricing where it is.
And Meghan, let's talk healthcare broadly here in terms of the headwinds we're seeing within this space. Higher costs, certainly something that we've heard on these earnings calls already. Medicare Advantage, one of those big drivers of the costs. How much visibility do we have in terms of how much that's already been reflected here? And when you look at the names across the board, who's the most exposed?
I think anyone with a heavy book in Medicare Advantage on the payer side has more risk and exposure, especially for the near term in 2024. You have pent-up demand from patients from COVID, and Medicare Advantage is a very rich and positive program for a senior if they have it. So you're seeing an increased demand in expensive medical care that is really hitting some of the payers. And we saw recently with Cigna, they had less exposure to Medicare Advantage, so they navigated this a little bit better. So I think we're still seeing headwinds in terms of inflation, labor shortages, provider margin pressure. And like I just said, those with Medicare Advantage seem to have been hit a little bit harder, and that's going to take a little bit of time to work its way through the system.
And Meghan, we've been watching Big Pharma sort of adapt sort of post-COVID, at least, but post-peak COVID, and really looking at the what's next story. And you look at some of these 4 big chronic diseases that you lay out that we could be seeing more investment in: heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, and type 2 diabetes. How are we seeing inflows into those investments, and who do you think is best positioned?
I think all the big pharmas have indicated, Roche and Merck. Merck said, hey, we're willing to look at $15 billion deals. Everyone's looking at tuck-ins. I think where there is an economic value proposition and high clinical rigor, we're going to continue to see biopharma do tuck-in acquisitions, and will continue to be very active. So I think they all sit quite well. Even Bristol Myers said they're willing to do a bolt-on acquisition. So I expect biopharma will, especially the larger players, will continue to be quite active. And we saw this at JP Morgan. Everybody was out hunting for rare diseases, immunotherapy, oncology, cardiovascular. all the areas that you mentioned. It's also why the GLPs are also interested in maybe showing their value prop in cardiovascular disease as well.
And just to follow, I want to ask you, because we talk about neurodegenerative diseases, about Neuralink. Obviously, still very early days with the very first patient here, but what sort of landscape are we looking at? Being that we've seen this in sort of the university sphere in testing, but what could we be looking at commercially here?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. It's one patient. It's very early. I'd imagine all the focus right now is on safety because you are talking about the brain. So we're going to be super concerned looking at, if there's going to be any brain bleeds, any infection. But brain computer interface, which is the technology that Neuralink is powered by, has been around for a while. It records and decodes the brain. And the thinking is it could really help people with severe paralysis be able to, with thought, command a robotic arm or help them with the computer. So I think it's super exciting in terms of area of research and interest. But again, it's one patient. We don't have the protocol. It is, a protocol that was obviously approved by the FDA, but the trial has not been uploaded to clinicaltrials.org, whereas where folks like us like to dig in to see what the protocol is and what the indication is. So I think very early, but obviously very exciting because of the potential impact in the patient population it's looking at.
Indeed, we'll be looking forward to see how that progresses. Appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. Meghan Fitzgerald, Grey Ghost Advisors private equity investor and Columbia University healthcare policy professor. Thank you so much.